this is the worst of both worlds. So I'm not saying we should, but just say we're thinking we need to go to help the US and Israel defeat Iran. Just say that's what the government decides our strategy. Well, you go in whole hog because this is a existential close to because the lifeblood of the global economy flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So if we're going to support this, we should be going all out. But we're sending one aircraft. So it's the worst of both worlds because we're not sending enough to make any real difference to the outcome, but we're sending enough and signaling enough to say we are a co-belligerent.
Welcome back to Bogan Intel, Major Cameron Leckie. It's really good to have you in here to talk about some of this escalating Gulf crisis and what it could mean for Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. There's quite a lot we could talk about right at the moment. The world is in a bit of turmoil, and hopefully today we can unpack some of that and work out why and maybe where we should go.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good start. For starters, could you recap a little bit about who you are and your ADF experience and why you've critiqued interventions like this one, especially now with decision to send the Wedgetail to the Gulf?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, I served 24 years in the Australian Army as an officer, retired with the rank of major, did a couple of deployments, none to the Middle East, but a couple of deployments, 3 deployments. And by the time, I don't know, a bit of a slow learner, but certainly the second half of the last quarter in particular of my military career, I'd sort of come to the conclusion that we weren't necessarily the good guys, and we, as the Australian Defence Force, what we were actually doing was supporting US imperialism rather than defending Australia and its national interests. By the time you get to that point, I guess serving in the military is sort of incompatible with your beliefs, so I decided to leave.
Now we are seeing essentially one of the biggest wars in a generation unfold. And with all your work, and some of your articles recently being critical of this developing conflict, how do you see Australia's involvement right now in this conflict with the announcement from Albanese that we'll be sending our Wedgetail airplane over there?
In responding to requests following a conversation that I had with the President, Mohammed bin Zayed, and other requests, Australia will deploy an E-7A Wedgetail to the Gulf to help protect and defend Australians and other civilians.
Well, straight up, we look at what happened. So, 28th of February, Israel, or from what I can gather, Israel attacked Iran, and then the United States either did it as a thinking, well, Iran's going to hit us back, so you might as well strike them as well, or it was coordinated. I mean, we won't really know that, but that's the story that's going around. And given that the US and Iran were in the middle of negotiations, like literally the day before, within hours of the Omani foreign minister, who was the sort of the go-between, saying we're making progress.
Mm.
They've launched the military attack. So I guess one word to describe that would be perfidy. Several commentators suggesting that the plan all along was to attack Iran. The negotiations were just, a distraction, and the ultimate goal was always to attack Iran. And I mean, to me, that sort of makes sense because it's not the first time the United States has done this, and not just against Iran. So what we have, if you look at the UN Charter, what we have, and also refer back to the International Military Tribunal and the judgment at Nuremberg, what we have is a textbook case of a war of aggression. I don't think we'll ever get a cleaner cut case than what we have here. And that under the UN Charter is clearly illegal under international law, and Australia signed up to international or UN Charter is under international law. We're key in the formation of the United Nations and the UN Charter. But what our government done is immediately supported the United States and Israel, so they supported a war of aggression.
And it was a very quick involvement that Australia sort of threw in there. We have more tentative governments around the world assessing the situation, some of whom are now directly negotiating with Iran around supply chains and oil and things like that. We will get on a little bit later to, where Australia's early involvement has left us or potentially limited some of our options. But the big news throughout the week was the sending of this AWACS aeroplane that we have, the E-7A Wedgetail. I would firstly, before we carry on, just if you could maybe speak a little bit about the capabilities of the Wedgetail, its importance to Australia, and how is it positioned to essentially support what's claimed as, UAE defence?
So the Wedgetail, I mean, I'm not in the Air Force, and it's been a few years since I've been, but it's an airborne early warning and control aircraft. So big radar systems, lots of electronics and etc. on board, which allows capture enormous amounts of information from hundreds of kilometers radius around it, um, and that is fused, and it's not, it doesn't just stick in the aircraft, or it's not just like a link from the aircraft to an Australian headquarters on the ground. It's fused within the greater sort of United States command and control architecture. So that means that the information that aircraft is collecting and sharing is being shared with the United States. And to say it's just a defensive deployment is, I mean, you can see how they can argue it, because it's not carrying missiles, it's not firing missiles, it's not carrying bombs, not firing bombs at anyone. But all that intelligence information that's collected is being fused and then used for other purposes, which could well be offensive. So, targeting information for targets inside Iran. So it's a bit like, with the F-35s and the Bombay parts that Australia produces, and, it's part of the international consortium that keeps the F-35 in operation going to Israel. It's a bit like the sort of silliness to saying that we're not providing lethal components, because it's not something that explodes, but it's all this. It's without that sort of information, you can't plan, you can't target, you can't prosecute. So we're directly contributing to that, which means that it is far from defensive.
And it is one of our most advanced and expensive aircraft too, right?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure exact cost, but there'd be hundreds of millions, I'd imagine, of cost. I think we've got 6 of them, so it's quite a valuable asset. And you think also, like, from if defending Australia's airspace, if we were to lose one or more, that's putting a big hole. When you've only got 6 aircraft, that's putting a big hole in your capabilities. And I guess the key point here is that, from if you think about, we all the messaging that we hear from the government is really about the that's for domestic consumption. Like, that's the public facing story. What we're actually after, I'm not sure, but there'll be other discussions and reasons why we're doing this, which the public aren't privy to. Um, and if you think, then Iran's got a vote here, as we're finding out every day. And if you just think about, from an Iranian government's perspective, whether Australia is defending the UAE or
Mm.
Australia is a belligerent or co-belligerent in the conflict, you don't. I mean, it's a very logical conclusion for the Iranians to think we are very much involved, because you just look at the history of what Australia has done over recent years with regards to Iran. Um, and there's not been much in the way of friendly or diplomatic behaviour. Like, I think on Twitter, I did a tweet a couple of days ago, and I just off the top of my head, it came up with 10 things without really thinking that the Australian government has done, which, if you're sitting in Iran, if you're sitting in Tehran, you're thinking that country is hostile towards us, which means that that aircraft and the crew are targets. And if we've seen what happened, there's 5, which has been reported by, I think, the Wall Street Journal, so you'd have to, sort of trust it. 5 refueling aircraft of the US Air Force in Saudi Arabia
Yeah.
were damaged on the ground. So there's no reason to think that Iran would hold back from targeting an Australian aircraft, given how hostile we are towards Iran.
And we were involved in the opening salvo of that conflict, with 3 Australian service personnel involved in the submarine that took out the IRIS Dina, returning from military exercises in India. And also, combined with the fact that early warning detection systems have been taken out, and as you mentioned, wedge-tail sized planes are being taken out throughout the region, it seems like there'll be a few targets on these very capable aircraft that's providing a bit of a gap that's increasingly growing in that capability in the region too, right?
Well, I mean, Iran has a strategy, and it is prosecuting the strategy. And from, I think, you have to give them credit. They've thought through how they would be attacked, what their vulnerabilities are, but more importantly, also what our, as in the Western or United States and Israel's vulnerabilities are. And a key vulnerability, or critical vulnerability, is it's what we call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and that ties into command and control. So I think I think we can safely say there's at least four major radar systems for the THAAD, so theatre level air defence missile interceptors, have been destroyed. They're ground-based radars. I think they cost somewhere between half a billion and a billion a pop. They've been destroyed, which suggests that the air picture that the United States from command and control can see is going to be greatly whittled back, which is hence why the airborne early warning and control aircraft are so important. So it's logical to think, the further Iran degrades the ability of the United States to see, the more beneficial it is for them. So once again, it's just another reason why that aircraft has a big fat target sitting on it.
And 85 Australian personnel servicing that aircraft too.
Yeah, I mean, for the aircraft to fly, you need obviously the crew, maintenance, logistics, command and control. So it's perfectly, you can't deploy the aircraft without that. But once again,
it'd be almost good to get handed over to the US to use at the moment. I mean, we don't want it.
All care, no responsibility. Yeah. Yeah. So once again, that puts them in a dangerous situation. And the cynical side of me thinks, well, if because this could be the thin end of the wedge, like we've done so many times before. Like look at Vietnam, we start off with a training team, we end up with, I think at the peak we had 3 battalions and everything that goes with that in Nui Dat. So thousands of soldiers. So this could be the thin end of the wedge, and I think the government, because there has been quite a backlash. I'm not sure percentage wise, but there's been quite a backlash against the deployment. But what better way to get the public on side for a greater deployment, or justifying a greater deployment, than if Australian service people come home dead or wounded? So a cynical side of me thinks that part of this tethered goat sort of thing. They're put out there to do a task, and then if there's casualties, then the government can then say we need to send more to defend ourselves. Like we've been around this roundabout before, and that's a cynical side of me. Maybe that wasn't in the calculations, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was.
Yeah, maybe a bit of equal parts tethered goat and just a equal parts, mass incompetence at a grand scale here. I mean, the muscle memory within the Australian decision makers here are to kind of fluff around on the edges of a very dangerous war zone like in Syria or Yemen and things like that. And I think there might be a little bit of a feeling within Canberra and potentially within the brass that think that they can do the same thing here. But this is a very different scenario, right?
Yeah, so this is the worst of both worlds. So I'm not saying we should, but just say we're thinking we need to go to help the US and Israel defeat Iran. Just say that's what the government decides our strategy. Well, you go in whole hog, because this is a existential close to, because the lifeblood of the global economy flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So if we're going to support this, we should be going all out. But we're sending one aircraft. So it's the worst of both worlds, because we're not sending enough to make any real difference to the outcome, but we're sending enough and signaling enough to say we are a co-belligerent, which is the worst of both worlds. If you want to go to war and try to win it, we should fully commit. I'm not saying that's what we should do, but I'm saying if you want to get involved in a war, you don't hold back and go half hog. You have to prosecute it to win it. But what we're doing is just enough to tie us in, and that's going to have ramifications, which when we get to the economics, I think we can talk about. It's going to have powerful negative impacts on the Australian economy.
And the belligerents are as careless and irresponsible and callous as they've ever been, more so than I've seen in my lifetime. And just to think that we've lumped in here, compared to with Iraq as well, where there was a little bit of argy-bargy in Canberra, at least it was audible.
Good evening. Sadly, we are tonight a deeply divided nation. We are divided because the government and the Prime Minister have committed us to a war we should not be in. It's a war contrary to Australia's national interests. For the first time in our proud history, an Australian government has committed our servicemen and women to war against the clear will of the Australian people.
And there was a protracted period of manufacturing consent, however bullshit it was, that led to Colin Powell sort of dangling a vial out in front of us, and we went to war. But here, it just feels like this sort of rushed, reactive, unplanned action where, there was a report that's just come out saying that in the US, Brass was saying from the start that the straits are going to close, and the US doesn't have an actual response to that. Like, how can the US be involved in an action like that when they can't control an outcome, like the closure of the oil pipelines of the world?
Well, I think this is where we need to zoom out, and I mean, the action, the war in against Iran is the center of our attention at the moment for good reason, but and we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. And the first article I put on Substack was called "The Crusade Against Multipolarity," and I think what we're seeing is, this is part of that crusade. So the crusade against multipolarity, basically led by the US, with the usual suspects supporting it. That's the European Union, UK, Australia, and a gross negligent omission in my initial piece. I didn't have Israel in there, but obviously they're involved in that as well. And back to 2018 or thereabouts, the BRICS countries, their GDP by PPP, purchasing power parity, overtook the G7, and has been, the gap's been growing. So that the global south, the global majority, is becoming more and more powerful. And if you look at the, are you familiar with the Wolfowitz doctrine? It was part of the initial draft of the defense planning guidance from the US in 1992 was drafted by Wolfowitz, and basically it said that the US had to prevent, at a global scale, any power or group of powers challenging the United States' position. And if you look at every action the United States has taken, it was watered down in the final version. It was leaked to the New York Times, and it was watered down. But if you look at every action that the US has taken in the context of that in the last 30 years, and it all aligns with that, desire, objective, aim to maintain American hegemony and make sure that other countries, can't, challenge the United States. So that's where we're at, and the United States are now being challenged.
So is that the wars and the color revolutions as well? Correct. That we've seen throughout the world?
Yeah, all of that. Yeah, the conflicts, the direct conflicts, the color revolutions, the use of human rights as a vector to attack other countries, the sanctions, they're all part of it. So when you look at, you zoom out and you look at all these things, you can just start to see the jigsaw pieces come into the puzzle. So I've sort of titled it "The Crusade Against Multipolarity" to try and give it a way to conceptualize what we're talking about. And it's gone into overdrive the last few years because the US is desperate. The empire is falling apart, and they're not going to just let that occur. I mean, their actions prove they're not going to occur. So the war in Ukraine, that was the first major component. So virtually all the coverage in the West about evil Russians attacking Ukraine, blah 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 blah. But it's pretty clear that the United States and its allies, they deliberately triggered a war, and then they could have ended it. It could have ended in April 2022, but they wanted to weaken Russia. Bojo flew into Kiev, said fight on, and hence we are here several years later. The war's still going, and Ukraine's being destroyed. So they failed to weaken Russia. That was their objective. They failed to weaken it. The plan, the idea being that they collapse the Russian economy, and then all that mineral energy resources that Russia have would be available to the West, for cents on the dollar. And then it's also taken out as a geopolitical competitor. So that failed. They've been trying with China, with other, the Uyghur, all the allegations against China with Uyghur and the containment of China, like that was from 2017 or whatever when Obama announced that. But they haven't quite got ready to get to China. But Iran is also critical to this. You think where it's located, who it supplies energy to, and its alignments, it's critical. So if they failed in Russia, if they can take Iran out, that helps advance that crusade against multipolarity. And the increasing desperation means that they've acted, even though they really, I mean, if you're to do a probability assessment of how likely this was to succeed, unless you believe all your own propaganda that the Iranian regime was ready to collapse as soon as we dropped the first bomb on it. The probability is very low, and we're now finding that out only 2 or 3 weeks into the conflict, how low it is. But this is all part of a bigger scheme, a bigger plan to regain or maintain hegemony, and it's falling apart at the seams. And I think this will rapidly accelerate the end of the US empire.
Yeah, it's definitely feeling that way, Cameron, and we've seen these kind of flashpoints across the world in the neo conservative era. You mentioned hyper accelerated after that end of history period, where America enjoyed about 10 years of unipolar hegemony there. It spent that ammunition in these wars, the global war on terror. Then it rolled the dice again against Russia and Ukraine. And now you got to imagine, you got to wonder how much ammunition it's got left as it's rolling out this big campaign in Iran. And it's such a discombobulated force. You mentioned the pivot to Asia from Obama. That was, I think, in 2011 in Canberra, where he made that statement about China.
As we end today's wars, I have directed my national security team to make our presence and mission in the Asia-Pacific a top priority. As a result, reductions in U.S. defense spending will not, I repeat, will not come at the expense of the Asia-Pacific.
And that whole idea about containing China, well, what was the response? I mean, Beijing ended up rolling out into the South China Sea and working on those shoals and atolls and reefs and essentially consolidating its maritime hegemony in that region. Every action has had a response for Washington, and they've been so discombobulated, and domestically distracted and, driven by all sorts of different interests, including out of Tel Aviv, that they haven't really strung together enough wins or enough steps in order in the right direction, right? They've always pivoted from a Trump idea back to an Obama idea. I mean, Iran is the encapsulation of that. It's that JCPOA into that more hardened JCPOA, into Trump essentially repealing it but keeping the JCPOA, and then Biden having his opportunity to do the same thing, and then it ending up in this kind of war scenario. With Iran, it is something that it feels like most US presidents have realized the folly of doing this, which we can see in action right now. And it's just been a whittling down of maybe concentration span in US presidents over time, and just pressure and the whittling down of just pragmatic decision making. And now we finally have Netanyahu's war. What do you think about this war, Major Leckie? It would be good to get a little bit of an idea from someone who served in the ADF for as long as you about the dimensions of this war now, and what do you see?
It took a couple of days. Once again, you need to zoom out. So we got the current conflict, which started on the 28th of Feb, but this is a continuation of something else. So we had the 12-day war in June last year, which Israel, that was the Israel attack on Iran. And then the US, flew in, dropped a few bombs and said it's all over. And I think that was probably by mutual agreement between Iran and the US that we'll claim victory. But that was the opening stanza, if you like. Then we had the sanction, or the economic crisis in Iran, which we don't have to listen to the Iranians. Just listen to what the U.S. Treasury Secretary said. That's part of their economic statecraft, all the sanctions which created the economic crisis. And economic tradecraft, or another word for that is economic warfare, which is illegal. But that was what it was all about. The idea being that if we make the economic situation in Iran bad enough, there'll be protests out in the streets, and then from those protests, many of which were legitimate, the violence erupted. And I mean, once again, I don't think you have to be too cynical to think that US, Israeli were well involved in inciting the violence. And I think the evidence that the violence ended so quickly because the Iranians basically shut down Starlink. So without their communications, basically that sort of rebellion ended within a matter of days. So that was all part of it. And I guess, the other thing, I did a table on one of my Twitter tweets. There's a whole bunch of these organizations, non-governmental organizations, that talking about how many people have been killed in the riots and the responsibility of the Iranian government. And you can actually go and look online and see where they're funded by. And I think I found at least 5 or 6 which are commonly quoted in the Australian media and international media. And you go to their funding, and they're funded by the US government. So the US government is obviously funding organisations which are trying to amplify the narrative about the state of the Iranian government, how people want to overthrow it, and so it's all this is all part of a plan with an aim of collapsing the Iranian regime or the Islamic Republic. But that failed, and I think this is once again we're getting to the point of desperation. So that failed, and I can't remember who, but I've seen several Israeli politicians that say if we don't take out Iran now, yes, this will be our last chance for generations. So now that brings us to the present war, and it took me a couple of days. I wrote an article, "What's Iran's strategy?" on my Substack, and Iran's not defending itself. Sorry, correction. Iran is defending itself, but it's doing more than that. I think Iran actually has quite an ambitious objective, and that is to evict the United States from West Asia and the Persian Gulf. And that's so the destruction of their key command and control, now increasingly aircraft, either on the ground or in the air, is part of that. And they're also creating that wedge between the various Gulf states and the United States. So the United States has been shown incapable of defending those states, and Iran is like in a tit for tat escalatory ladder. So I think I saw the latest I saw was that the US launched some HIMARS rockets at that island. I can't remember the name of the island.
Karg Island.
Yeah. So they launched some HIMARS rockets at that island from just on the outskirts in the UAE, so in the urban areas of the UAE. And so now Iran said, well, that makes that a legitimate target. So every time the US does something, the Iranians are very controlled, lifting the escalation and driving a greater wedge. And they're also targeting the thing that hurts the West the most, and that's, of course, economics, the financial superstructure of which so much of it's concentrated in the Middle East. And so that's where this is heading. Now, Iran's taking a hell of a beating, but so much of their military infrastructure is underground. And also, it's hard to, I've never been to Persia, never been to Iran, etc. But, trying to gauge the feeling on the ground, and you see like the ABC, for example, reports on about the Kurds about to attack. I saw an article the other day, like the internal uprising. Then you see sort of the Iranian side with mass protests in support of the government and nightly vigils, etc.
And a French military official targeted from Kurdish intelligence too. In the region, trying to drum up Kurdish armies.
Yeah. So my feeling is that what they've done, like particularly how they started the war, so killing the Ayatollah, quite silly, because what that means is you've just assassinated the religious leader of the Shia, and straight upside, that's going to get a lot of people offside, and then the 170 odd schoolgirls that were killed in that school. If you wanted to do something to light a fire in the belly of the Iranian people, and even if they don't dislike or hate their government, you couldn't do much worse than that. And then all the targeting civilian infrastructure, hospitals and that. I think my take is that the majority of the Iranian people living in Iran, at least, they will fight this out. It's existential for their country, and they will fight this out. Their skin in the game, I think, is much higher than the Western, the world. They'll fight this out, and I think they have a strategy which they can actually achieve a victory on their own terms. And I guess the key point thing is here, there's no point Iran stopping today or tomorrow, because what's going to happen if they stop and say, all right, we've hurt each other enough, it's been very disruptive, what's going to happen? Well, it's what happened in the 12-day war. It'll just be 6 months or a year, 2 years, 3 years. And this is a bit like parallel to Russia and what's happening in Ukraine. They don't want a fix which is going to last till the next time Israel and the United States is ready to attack them. What they want is to set conditions where they can have a peaceful existence on their own terms, for a generation or more. And I think that's quite similar to what Russia's trying to do. So hence why they're not going to negotiate on anything less. And I saw one of the IRGC generals say what the conditions are for Iran to sort of end this. It's for the United States to pay compensation for all the damage they've caused, and also to leave.
The terms are quite tough, right?
Oh yeah,
And really, Washington has been calling up Tehran through channels in Moscow, through all sorts of channels every bloody day, and asking for this to stop. So, Iran has come out and said, we are not stopping. We have the upper hand right now. If they do it or don't, I'll let you be the judge of that one, Cam. But really, at the moment, we are seeing footage of what you say, this very modern asymmetric army that's able to penetrate Israeli airspace every day with hypersonic missile technology. And, we're not getting much of a picture of what's happening in the Gulf states in Israel at the moment. But some of the things coming through on social media right now, which is the only place you can really get access to some of the footage of this damage, I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, so you're correct. We're getting a very one-sided picture. So you see the damage being caused in Tehran, and most of it, I mean, when as horrific as it is, if you bomb an apartment block and destroy that, and kill some civilians, and that in the big picture, that doesn't degrade your war effort. Yes, you'll have some casualties, and there's the impacts on that, but that doesn't really degrade your war effort. Whereas what Iran is striking is critical components, both in Israel and across the Gulf, of the fundamental requirements to be able to launch a military campaign, and now they're extending into the financial. So I think an Iranian bank was hit the other day, and then they've just hit 3 US banks,
Citibank included in the UAE.
Citibank, yep. Tit for tat. And I think Iran can keep this up for months, if not years. Like, we don't obviously have any idea about the number of missiles that they prepared, but they've been preparing this war for 20 years because they could see it coming. I think after the Gulf War and Saddam Hussein and that, I think that was probably a turning point, thinking we can't just have a conventional military because that's playing to their strengths. And because this is the hubris and arrogance of empire, because the Iranians, they're the underdog. They're the ones whose existence is on the line. So their thinking and analysis of the situation and understanding their enemies is much, much greater than ours. Whereas because we're so used to having dominance and firepower, and with the US sort of basically imposing its will, well, not imposing its will, but causing havoc and destruction pretty much anywhere it wanted around the world without any real pushback, or open military defeat. Yes, there's been the strategic defeats, but it's not like there's been aircraft carriers sinking to the bottom of the ocean. So the US wasn't prepared for this sort of conflict, and Iran is. I mean, we know from open source stuff how many missiles, like air defense missile interceptors for THAAD and Patriot, the US can produce. We know in Ukraine they're basically, woefully insufficient, and they've fired hundreds, if not thousands, of Patriot interceptors, and Iran and Russia's now just hitting Ukraine wherever it wants with whatever it wants, pretty much. Now, and this is Iran's strategy. They fired hundreds and hundreds of drones and missiles in the first couple of weeks. Those air defense interceptors are now all but exhausted or at very low levels. So they only have to fire a handful of missiles at a time at key point targets. We know they can hit, you look at the radar domes and things like that from the 12-day war where, pinpoint accuracy. We know they can do that. We believe, if you listen to people like Alistair Crook and that the Chinese have provided them with alternate satellite comms and C2 systems, so they can do it very accurately without relying on Western technology. And all they need to do is keep pepping away until the global economy creaks. And this is where the whole sanctions approach to trying to force countries to do something they don't want to do is now being exposed. Like, if you look at Russia from, I think, about 2014, or after the Maidan, etc., is when all the sanctions started with Russia. And Iran's been sanctioned for decades. Well, that action reaction. So if the action is to sanction you, you're not just going to give up. You're going to find ways about it. So Iran is basically, significantly cut off from the global economy, which means that all those levers have been being reversed and used against, Western countries, because, it doesn't hurt Iran. Like, if the financial system collapses, what impact does that have on Iran?
It was resilient over the decades as well. And one thing I think that has to be said about Iran is, they're a civilization state, right? They're this, ancient culture with this beautiful art, literature, history, all these kind of things. And I think I think they're one of the only isolated civilization states on Earth. And I think, you could see it in their diplomacy, just this desire to want to be a part of the international community, to share some of the things that they're proud of their civilization state with the world. So, this continued in this like slow dance with the West, especially in this century, that kind of evolved from the axis of evil to where we have now. And I think we underestimate their willingness to be diplomatically engaged for weakness. And really, Iran was dragged kicking and screaming into this war. And now it is using a very unique ballistic missile capability and a very unique way of going about things. Have you heard of that Mosaic defense doctrine that they have?
Yeah, well, only really since the wars started. But once again, this is, they're planning and analysis.
Yeah, like I was about to say, like America's been playing checkers all around the world, and Iran now is playing this incredible game of chess in its region, and it's acting it out with aplomb.
Well, I mean, it'd be interesting in the fullness of time to, the historians that to study how they've actually achieved this. But a centralized system, that's what brought Saddam, well, not that probably would have made much impact, but they recognized from what happened in Iraq and elsewhere that if you have a centralized system, you're in trouble, because all you got to do is cut the head off and then the whole system stops working. So they have designed their system around that, their military response, so that the various commands and regions can continue regardless of what's happened in Tehran. So that's I find it a bit ironic, because in the Australian Army, I assume it still is, we have this doctrine of mission command, which is basically you give your subordinates what you want them to achieve, and you leave them up to them as to how they're going to achieve it. And it's meant to be in warfare, because things change in war. If you're waiting for orders from your superiors, by the time they make a decision, it's too late. Blah blah blah. So it's sort of recognizing the fluid nature of warfare. And we spoke a lot about it, and we'd have lectures on it, and all that sort of stuff. But we kid ourselves. We didn't have anything like mission command, because if you're a young officer and got out of line and did something what you thought you should do as opposed to what you were told, like, more often than not, you'd end up with a kick in the pants. But what Iran has done is implemented this at an epic scale. They've implemented it institutionally across their entire country, such that they have the broad intent of what they're trying to achieve. And they've got all the planning in place, such that if the central, the government itself or key components of the government cease to function, they can still prosecute this war.
And they sell that as like an escalatory factor as well, because they sort of say, look, if you want to keep removing our centralized command, our pragmatic and rational generals and leaders, well, then we're going to have these mad dog guys out in the field that are going to start doing things their way. And then, you're probably better off keeping us intact in some way and not letting these mosaic tiles start flying off on their own everywhere and smashing everything in the region.
Oh, yeah. So, what is war? Like, I remember my first footy coach when I was at the Defence Force Academy, Eddie Schlegel, say that, football, it's a controlled application of violence, just like, war is. And he's right. Warfare is a controlled application of violence, and Iran is doing that to perfection. Whereas you see what the US and Israel are doing by attacking hospitals and civilian targets, that's just violence. And if you want a political outcome, you need to control that application of violence. And from what I can tell, the Iranians are doing an awful lot better job of that than the US and the Israelis are.
Yeah, like today, there's news coming in that they're bombing the geometric sacred mosques of Isfahan just to break something. The most marvelous looking designs you've ever seen on Earth, just getting shattered by these jealous, angry people that are losing a war at the moment. And I'd like to maybe close a bit later on where we could talk a little bit about the escalation ladder and where a tactical nuclear weapon or nuclear response could sit. If you're enjoying these episodes with people like Major Cameron Leckie, talking about some pretty interesting topics that aren't covered really much anywhere else, make sure you support the channel in any way you can by liking and subscribing on our YouTube channel, or leaving a comment or a rating at wherever you hear this podcast, or go into www.boganintel.com, where for $5 a month You can sign up for articles and podcasts and any other news that may be coming through the channel. So with no further ado, back to Major Leckie. Look, I do want to get onto Albanese here. I mean, we're describing a pretty unique and open situation here. You were just talking about, Iran's capability, which is, something the West has underestimated, to say the least. And they are changing the balance in the region. I mean, Oman, Bahrain, these sort of countries that are now leaving this umbrella. And there's discussions in Saudi Arabia and throughout the GCC about, essentially leaving Americans, getting Americans out of the region for good. So some of Iran's, demands are actually being, maybe explored or met, even by Western powers. I mean, the French were on their way there with an aircraft carrier and some fleet as well, and they've turned around, saying, "No, we're out." But Australia's still flying in. So I do want to ask, how prudent is this decision, and how rushed is it if it's not prudent? And as other countries like France and, the GCC countries I've mentioned, as they're dealing with Iran over things that, are just essential, like even oil and trade, has Australia jumped the gun militarily? Is this a betrayal, a sovereign betrayal? That's what I wanted to ask.
Well, prudent or not, clearly imprudent. And once again, you come back to, I mean, there's a lot of hoopla and emotion and loose commentary in that, but you come back to what are each side's objectives. Like, I don't think anyone really knows what the US is. I don't think Trump knows himself. But I think we can, I've sort of already said what the Iran's objectives are. Now, the question is, can they achieve those objectives? And I think, and as you just sort of said, the answer is yes. So when it comes to Australia's military involvement, is like, well, what can we do to prevent? Well, first of all, what are our objectives? And if once we've worked those out, what can we actually do to sort of achieve those? And I don't think that's been thought through at all. And we sort of link back to the economy. Well, the first thing we'd be thinking is like, well, we need this war to end, because the economic impact, if it doesn't end within, literally days, if this keeps going for months, the impact will be horrendous. So that's got to be our first. And if you are on a, you got your whiteboard out and think of all the options in government, in defense or whatever, and it's like, what do we do? Well, the first thing would be, we need to stop the war. What can we do to stop the war? Well, the first thing is sending our pathetic little military capability. Not saying the aircraft's not capable, but in the scale of things, it's not going to make a difference. Why would you do that? How does that help end the war? It doesn't. It will help drag us in and help prolong it, but it will not end the war. And I guess we have a mirror here once again with Ukraine. Like, the Australian government position is a just and lasting peace for Ukraine, whereas if any sensible analysis will says there is no just and lasting peace for Ukraine. The best they can do is meet Russia's terms now, because Russia's terms tomorrow will be harsher. And I think we can see similar for Iran. The longer this goes on, particularly those countries who are considered to be hostile belligerents, the higher the cost will be. So first of all, that would be not a military response, a diplomatic response. And noting that who initiated the conflict, i.e. the United States and Israel, what can we do to pressure those countries to stop? But I mean, this is unheard of talk in Australia, because we, as was mentioned earlier, reflexive support to the United States no matter what. So the United States supports a genocide, we support a genocide. The United States supports a war of aggression, we support a war of aggression. So we're captured in some way, whether that's intellectually or some other deeper, more sinister way, we're captured. But I guess if just hypothetically, because this I just can't see happening, but we have leverage. We have a thing called Orcus, a cash cow for the United States. We could say, oh, because of the United States war of aggression and continued destruction and the damage it's doing to Australia's interests, we're going to pull out of the Orcus deal. Which, I mean, this would be a perfect opportunity to do that. We have the Force Posture Agreement, which basically gives the US the ability to use agreed facilities such as airports, ports, other military facilities, unimpeded access. So we've handed over our sovereignty. So there's a clause in that, repeal within 12 months. We could start the process to repeal the Force Posture Agreement. And then we have things like Pine Gap. So we could whole bunch of things, and there's a couple of examples which we could do. And also the other thing is, I don't think there's been any thought whatsoever to our region and what they think of our actions. Like, once again, we have taken an action which will be seen in as our region as, contrary to the United Nations Charter, contrary to this so-called rules-based order we keep harping on about. So we've dug ourselves a hole, which will be very difficult to get out, and we have seemingly no thought as to the consequences of our actions. When in actual fact, we do have some options, as I just laid out before.
You've laid out a whole ton of options there, and every single one of them could, have some bearing on what's happening here. But you have to wonder just how ideologically aligned they are in their body, mind, and soul. Some of these decision makers in Canberra with Washington, even the UK has had some kind of daylight between Washington on this one. And what this whole stanza has done, which has really happened under the Albanese government since October 7, has revealed that Australia is the closest core vassal state to Washington, and potentially one of the most influenceable nations on earth from Tel Aviv, right?
And this is what I mean. It's really disheartening, because, like, you think you're governed by people who are governing in your country's interests, but every time there's something happens, it's almost like if you took on first principles what was the right thing to do, the government will do the opposite of the right thing, which says there's, I mean, it's hard to avoid sort of coming to sort of dark, nefarious things happening to our country, but it's almost like our government is controlled elsewhere. And I mean, what the actual mechanisms and who, we can make some guesses as to, but I just, when you see a pattern of behavior, a pathology of behavior over over time, and many different examples where they could have done, the right thing, complied with international law as one example, it really starts to make you question who's controlling our country. And that also then leads to, well, we vote, but do we have a democracy when other powers, whether they be international or people behind the scenes who we don't really know, we can make some guesses but don't really know, are pulling the strings?
And regarding with Iran too, right, Cameron, on what you say, like, Australia has had a pretty means-tested, unique relationship with Tehran over the years. It's been fraught with all the crap of the axis of evil, and lots of pressure from our Western allies to put pressure back on them. But leading up to that ASIO report that implicated Iran in a couple of those anti-Semitic attacks that happened in 24, 25, Australia had a very robust relationship with Tehran, and often acted as a conduit between Western powers and Iran, and a sober actor between them. What the hell went wrong there? And Albanese really has shown, and his government has shown, that they have been willing to go all in every single action, conflagration, anything that the US has put its hands towards. If de-escalation comes through talks and not through, nuclear annihilation of half of the planet, where does Australia's early involvement make it stand, globally, you think?
Well, we're on the path to making ourselves a pariah nation. Like, you know, it's not like, you think in Iraq in 2003, at least they had a fig leaf of a reason for what they did, the weapons of mass destruction. Well, they're not even hiding that now. And all this comes back to, I think, the decline of an empire, the desperation. Warwick Powell, who talks about autoimmune response. So every time, they're trying to stop the decline, just make it worse through their actions. And I think it comes back to our inability as a country, at least partly. It comes back to our inability as a country to align our geography with who we are as a nation. So I think a lot of it comes back to the fear of being a mostly sort of white country at the bottom of Asia, and as a result, we see that we have to support the United States because that's our security blanket, and so that builds that reflexive response, which is just so ridiculous, and I think, to be honest, I think racism is a key part of this. Like, we're a white Anglo-Saxon, well, predominantly white Anglo-Saxon nation, and most of the people in positions of power, look like me, and probably just can't fathom a world in which white people aren't dominant. So I think that's got a lot to do with it. But it's just like, it's a ridiculous position to hold, because yeah, we have benefited so much from the growth of China. China got us through the GFC. Like, without the Chinese support in the GFC, we would have had a hell of a lot rougher time. China, and not just China, but when we're in that region of the world where it's going to be going forward, it's going to be the most dynamic part of the world where the most growth is. So, it just doesn't make sense to not want to be part of that. And if we are part of it, and we build the relationships and security within our region, well, what are the things we fear would disappear? But so I think this is our colonial sort of hangover over a couple of centuries now. We just haven't um, managed to work out who we are as a country and how we can fit, being a country of First Nations people, of Europeans from, Anglo-Saxon sort of background, and then every other wave of immigrants that's come since. Like, if we can align those three things into a coherent, who we are as a country, we can fit very nicely into, the multipolar world, in the Southeast Asia and Eurasian landmass, which is sort of, kicking goals going forward in the 21st century. We could do really well as be secure. But I think it's our colonial hang-ups of our past, which a segment of the population and those in power seem to be stuck on. It's probably arguably our biggest threat, our inability to adapt to a new world.
Yeah, and like we're talking a couple of decades of revisionism too that have compounded that, Cameron. I mean, like under Keating, we probably got the closest where we could to seeing that identity. And then under Howard and that kind of northern hemispheric mindset that developed after the 9/11, we lost that kind of touch. So much so that we don't even know how to talk to our bloody Pacific Island family that we keep mocking all the friggin' time. You know what I mean? And the same thing, if it was one step forward and two steps back under coalition governments in Asia. And you even see with Penny Wong, even condescendingly wagging her finger at our neighbors and telling what they should or shouldn't be doing with regards to China. But at the same time, the hypocrisy from this government, the way that they've conducted themselves abroad and the way they're conducting themselves right now.
I think, you're familiar with the term kakistocracy?
Yeah.
Yeah, government by the least capable. I think they're where we've got, and I think a key part of that is, I mean, politics really has just become a game for those who play it. With you start off as a staffer, and then you become nominated, and then you get elected, and whatever. So they're detached from the real world. I think that's part of it. I don't think our education system helps. Like, I can just remember what I did in high school, and then I've seen, my kids go through high school and the sort of level of assessments and that they're doing. I think we've gone backwards there. And if you want, and this is where racism and that also breeds, is ignorance. So if you have a poorly educated population, or especially on matters pertaining to the world and our place in it, and that breeds ignorance, and ignorance is what you need for racism to flourish. And then a political class who, clearly in it mostly for their own benefit, and it's just a game of musical chairs, and they live in a bubble. Like, they're just, it's quite interesting watching their tweets and whatever, and how many times they get ratioed. Like, but I don't think it. What we say, I really don't think matters. They're living in their own sort of bubble. I think there's powers that we don't really understand that are pulling the strings, and as long as they're happy, that's what keeps it ticking along. And then, between Liberal and Labor, just a duopoly. It's like just, an argument over who's going to have sort of the, the slight variation in the theme, but it's all the same class of people, and they're not really acting in our interests. That's sort of, and I think we're seeing the consequences of that now, and those consequences are going to last for generations.
And it's tipping more and more. And then you have to wonder what the fuel crisis and the economic crisis is going to do, especially as like Australians who, maybe aren't politically engaged, start to sort of pull their head up a little bit as things get a little bit too hard for them. There are servos that are running out of fuel right now. And these kind of like fake relationships that we've had with our neighbors, including like China, for example, who saved us in the GFC, who essentially has transformed our economy into what it is today, with no value add, with no innovation that we've done with that money, by the way. But the thing is like, when they cut off our avgas the other day, there was a report, I think, I forget what percentage it is, a large percentage of our avgas is refined in China. We're the first ones to miss out as a consequence of these tenuous and fake relationships that we've had with our neighbors at the expense of doing everything for this bully big brother that we keep following around and dragging their coattails. We're going to lose out here. And let's get on to that fallout, here. We are seeing some huge hits in the medium to short term. Oil price spikes, shipping disruptions. So it's going to be more than just like delayed Amazon packages in Australia. There's a lot more going on here. I interviewed Rex Patrick about this the other day, who was mentioning some of these really alarming sovereign supply issues. So yeah, could you speak to us a little bit about that impact on households, inflation, exports, agriculture, blah, 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 heaps of stuff?
Yeah, so I've said, sort of tongue in cheek, but sort of not, that we're an unserious nation governed by unserious people. And what I mean by that is, we've had known issues for decades which we've done nothing about. As an example, got published in the Australian Army Journal in 2007 essay called Peak Oil in the Australian Army, which is basically how vulnerable we were to oil and, availability of oil, and that we needed to do something. No, I wasn't alone. Like, one of my peers did a PhD on this topic. You have people like Air Vice Marshal Blackburn, who's retired Deputy Chief of Air Force, done a lot of work on this. So we've known for decades that Australia has a massive dependency on imported oil, that we haven't been meeting our obligations under the International Energy Agency for, 90 days of supply in case of disruptions. And now, because you never know when the disruption is going to occur. Like, if we can predict these things, we'd never have reserves for anything. But so now we're caught short with about a month's worth when it started, 30 days worth of fuel, and we should have had 90 if we're meeting our obligations. And we have all this farcical, of the previous Liberal government, who creates a small extra reserve for Australia in the United States. Like, it's a joke. It's not serious. This is what I mean by unserious nation governed by unserious people, because if that's your plan, it's not serious. I mean, and it goes without saying, everyone knows how important, liquid fuels are to the Australian economy. So I don't think we need to go on too much there. People know the cost of everything will go up, and availability will go down. We're already seeing spot shortages, but I think we need to think a bit longer term. So let's assume this war goes on for months, and I think that's pretty reasonable, given Iran can sustain it. Israel wants to destroy Iran, and the United States is in a hole and doesn't know how to get itself out without a great humiliation. So that's all recipe for the war going on. Mm-hmm. And so 90% of our oil comes from overseas, imported. And, everything was working up to the 28th of Feb, and there were ships that were loaded, and, there's sort of going to be a bit of a hangover of oil supply coming in from stuff that was already shipped. I'm not sure, I can't remember, I haven't looked up for a while, but I think it's 20 days or something thereabouts to get from the Middle East to Australia. But a lot of our oil doesn't come directly from there. It comes from other countries that refine it, whether in Southeast Asia or India, etc. So they get the crude oil, turn it into diesel, turn it into jet fuel, turn it into petrol. So all those that intermediate step from taking crude oil, that's now starting to get disrupted. So that means it's not, and I saw the minister yesterday had, next week we'll have this much fuel, the same as last week. Well, that's fine. But it's what's going to happen in a month. What's going to happen in 2 months, when the 20% of the global oil that doesn't leave the, the Persian Gulf is locked in. That's going to create systemic shortages amongst the refiners. Which means that Australia's imports are also going to have systemic shortage. Now, I think it's highly unlikely we'll have no oil, but, we need to be prepared for a situation where we might have 80%, 60%, 50%, I don't know, but a figure less than what our economy needs to function. And our economy, we're metabolizing all the time. We need to eat every day. We need we need to move stuff every day to keep the economy and that surviving. And we're not designed, yeah, sure, we won't go out on the weekend or something, but most people live, 15, 20, 30 kilometers from work. How do you get to work if you don't drive a car?
Mm.
How do you keep the supermarket stocked if you're not, you can't cut back on food, because that way, people start to go hungry. So our capacity to reduce, particularly for diesel, which is the most important fuel, to reduce consumption is quite limited. And so,
Especially in a country so big and so
yeah,
wide, and without
and
trucks, Australia stops, and we need them to get across.
do you know what the average distance of the Australian food supply chain is? So from a product getting from point of origin to a supermarket,
It'd have to be the longest in the world, almost.
it's about 1,000 kilometres. So our food system, and I mean, it's great in normal times, like if you sort of don't worry about the other flow-on impacts of, traffic on roads and how much fuel's being consumed and emissions and stuff like that. But it means that we can get, pretty much whatever product you want anywhere in the country at any time of year. So, if we have say we have 3/4 of the fuel we need, well, how do you sustain a system which requires the average item of food, to travel 1,000 kilometres with great difficulty? So I guess the point I'm getting at is, yes, we might be fine this week, and we might be fine next week. We might be fine for a couple of weeks, but you only have to do a little bit of foresight to say, if this war continues and the Gulf or the Strait of Hormuz is closed for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, we're going to face significant shortages. And the government has legislation to do something about it. It's called the Liquid Fuel Emergency Act. And it can be activated for a likely or actual disruption to liquid fuel supplies. I would put money on it. I'm not a gambler, but I would put money on it. We're going to have some form of liquid fuel shortage within, I don't know, a month, maybe. I mean, when I'm saying
Maybe
that,
less.
I'm not saying that the odd petrol station here or there. I'm not talking about that, because that's like just the current system trying to struggle to rebalance. But I'm talking about systemic shortages, like 20, 30% across the nation. That is foreseeable. That's going to happen within, I'd say, a month.
It's already happened in an aviation industry, according to that report from China.
That's right.
Yep.
So that is an emergency. That is like a likely crisis.
So Cameron, sorry to interrupt, but what could we see? Would there be working from home measures put in place? Would there be some kind of travel restrictions? Like we've never lived in a time like this, really, have we?
Yeah, well, it will be a bit similar like COVID. Like, I think within a week or two, I was meant to be traveling for work tomorrow down to New South Wales, 1,500-kilometre trip. I cancelled it Monday last week because I thought, this is probably not the best use of a couple hundred litres of diesel for what I was, planning to. In normal times, you do what you do for work, but I think so. I actually cancelled it early because I could see this coming. But I mean, you can do some of that. But there's a lot of people who can't work from home, and the things that actually keep the economy going generally are people who have to be out and about.
Of course.
I have a bit of land out near Gatton in Queensland, and we drive past all so the Gatton's the Lockyer Valley, one of the big horticulture hubs in Australia, and a lot of our fresh vegetable comes from. And every time you drive out there, what do you see? You see all these people picking tomatoes or whatever, shallots, whatever the crop is. There'll be 15 cars lined up along the side of the road. So you can't stop them to get. You need them to get to work, because otherwise, if you don't have someone picking, it's not getting on a truck to go to the cold store, to go to Woolworths or Coles. So there's only so much we can do before things start breaking.
And also just petrochemicals in general, right? And things like fertilizer, urea fertilizer from shut down gas plants in Qatar and things like that. Wow, yeah.
Yeah, so we did in my work, we've done a little bit of modelling of what the impact of price and availability of urea is. So I mean, we've already seen there's already farmers who have stopped. So we have a distinct sort of winter cropping cycle in Australia. Winter dominant, so wheat, etc. And they're various parts of the country getting ready for the winter cropping cycle. They've already seen, online and that farm, and I think it's even reported in some media that farmers have stopped because they haven't been able to get diesel. And if you miss a window, that means they probably won't get a crop in this year, and that's been from diesel. But the other thing is we have a just-in-time supply chain for our fertilizers, and
Yeah.
urea is a nitrogen fertilizer. It's the most commonly used, widely used fertilizer in the country. 2/3 of our urea fertilizer comes from, guess where?
Middle East, Qatar.
The Middle East. So we will. I mean, the other third comes around Asia, etc.
Pretty strange. That's made from LNG byproduct, right? Why the heck have we got urea dumps in WA where they're just dumping the crap there? But why don't we have any Australia-made urea product, Cameron? Is there a reason for that?
This is another example of an unserious country governed by unserious people. So we have enormous amounts of natural gas, yet because of economics, we decided, I think it was Incitec Pivot had a urea plant here in Brisbane. And, because of economics, they closed it down because it was cheaper to import it. But from a national interest perspective, having fertilized, especially, Australia is an old continent. Our soils are old, depleted, just through, being so old. And then you apply European style agricultural practices, which require, a certain level of inputs to maintain yields. From a national interest perspective, you'd think that you want to have your own domestic source of fertilizer, particularly given how rich we are in natural gas.
And how much our economy relies on these agricultural exports, that are a massive chunk of everything we do. We create currently somewhere around 3 times the food we consume, right? Something like that.
Yeah. So we will face a urea shortage this year. We will hopefully be able to get some from other countries, but there's going to be huge demand from a range of countries to do that. And if they require gas from, the Persian Gulf to create the urea somewhere else, well, their capacity. So any way you look at it, there's going to be some form of shortage.
But is the urea production monitored by the IEA as well, or is there like a global fertilizer body or something like that?
I'm not
Yep.
sure. We have Fertilizer Australia is the industry body in Australia, and I know they're looking at options, and they're working overtime to try and address this. And farmers do have some options. So if they can get diesel and the seed, you can switch to an alternate crop. So, for example, instead of growing wheat, you could grow chickpea. So farmers could still get a crop in, but that's mostly for export markets. I mean, because we do export so much, and most of what we grow or use urea for is the broadacre crops that we export. This is sort of decision making we need to, like, a centralized decision making is, what are our priorities? Because if we can't feed ourselves, exporting is probably, yes, it'll bring in some revenue, but you need to feed yourself. And then, like, we need urea for dairy because cows, they need high protein pastures, which you don't get without urea. For our fruit and vegetables, you need urea to get that. So fresh fruit and vegetables and dairy, I'd say, need to be a priority. But then and this is the mess it is, and this is why we need to stop ASAP, is like, all right, what are you going to say to a farmer? It's like, you can farm, but you can't, or you're only allowed to have this much. Like, the financial implications for farm businesses, if they can't plant, could be catastrophic. So, there's no real answer to this other than stopping the war before it, continues any longer, which the Australian government is doing the opposite of what needs to happen.
And those missing balancing middle smaller powers that used to be there, to throw their 2 cents in about, a conflict like that. Once upon a time, that was Australia getting involved in that pragmatic group of, in the international community, which trying to, mitigate some of this stuff. And the escalation power that Iran has is over these liquid fuels. And Trump is talking about boots on the ground. The administration, as you said, doesn't know what it's doing, so it's got no other option but to put boots on the ground and double down. And this conflict does have the feeling that it's going to last a lot longer than the market and our government would really like. So I want to ask, just at the end here, if this goes on for a year or two, and these supply chains are, essentially crushed or severely diminished, What could daily life look like in Australia in a prolonged nightmare?
Yeah. Um, I wrote an article called "The Great Discontinuity" on my Substack, and I think that's what we're facing. So there was a world before 28th of Feb, and now we're seeing a bit of a bifurcation. So I don't think once this is all played out at many levels, what we see will be quite different to what the world we know now. Some of that could be very good outcomes, and I
Yeah.
guess that's what I'm focusing on is, what positives can we take from this, and how do we get from where we are to that? I mean, there's going to be a degree of pain in the interim, but you think economies are complex adaptive systems. So that what does that mean? That means they have emergent properties. So we can't really predict what's happening, but people don't just sit on their hands. People, well, some people do, but you know, the broader population, when you real this is why I've been. You might have seen on my Twitter feed, I've been doing my daily preparations when I'm doing the vegetable garden, because like I think a lot of people just don't quite understand how serious this is from our economy. But when people start realizing, A, this is going to go for a long term, and B, this is going to have negative impacts, well, then people start coming up with alternative ideas. Hopefully, we'll start, there'll be community and work together to solve problems opposed to, competing and fighting against one another. But there could be, there could be negative outcomes as far as like sort of emergent properties, or it could be positive. And I think that's what we need to position ourselves to try and make as positive a change as we can, given the situation. And I think part of that will be I'm expecting a mass changeover in politicians at the next election, because they've failed. They will have proven to have failed dismally by the time we get to, was it 2028? Is that the next one? And the economic, let's say, troubles that we go through, they'll all have been exposed as to, and both Liberal and Labor has been exposed as, not doing due diligence to prepare Australia for what was a foreseeable event, and then jumping on board with a war of aggression when the real issue for Australia is not the war between Israel and United States and Iran. It's like, what do we do to prepare our economy? So I think there's going to be a whole lot of politicians looking for new jobs come the next election.
And perhaps the re-emergence of a little bit of a sovereign consciousness
Oh yeah,
within the
yep,
Australian population.
yep.
And maybe a little bit of a feeling like there's a firecracker behind some of these politicians as well, because they have been coasting in this bipartisan bubble you mentioned, essentially outsourcing our sovereign future for decades with each other. And you're right, they don't care about what we say. We haven't had these big national discussions since John Howard's put us to bloody sleep about 25, 30 years ago, too, as we're about to go through the skids and the economy is about to go down. And the government, once again, is going to call on us to be good citizens, and ask about social cohesion. And we're going to turn around and go, look what you guys have been doing to us for the last few years, the pressure you've been putting on us, from the pandemic through. And it's going to be hard to walk side by side with the government. I think many people are going to be struggling to, take these directives and orders from a government that has been dividing our society on both sides of politics for quite a while.
The solution is not going to come from the government. The solution is going to come from us working together to create a better system. So I mean, there's a risk of that where you get ideologues and certain types of people who'll use it to push their own agenda. But I think the average Australian's a pretty reasonable person, just wants to get along in life and whatever. I think that's we get the mass of Australia on side working together to send us in a different direction. I think we can, after whatever occurs between now and the sort of immediate crisis is passed. We could have this could be a massive opportunity to realign ourselves with a bit of reality. Because I guess there's nothing like survival. So it's like the Iranians. There's nothing like survival to sharpen your sense of awareness and
Sure.
importance of various things. And that's I think of the apathy which has been well known in Australia for decades. I think we're going to find that apathy is going to disappear over the next few months.
Yeah, and even Clive Palmer and One Nation talking about taxing the gas giants and trying to move around, and you're right, those orthodoxies aren't going to cut it anymore. And yeah, we may think that potentially next election there might be people like yourself that are getting up everywhere across the country and having a crack with a much more conscious voting bloc that's kind of really looking to throw these guys on their ass. Cameron, incredible to have you on. You're our military expert on Bogan Intel, and it's always great to have, your very unique but excellent perspective.
Thanks, Joel. And hopefully next time we chat, things will have eased off a bit and the future's looking brighter. But yeah, we've got some interesting times ahead.
Yeah, if we can avoid World War III, we might be able to, do it. The sky's the limit, right? That's exactly what we're talking about. Take care, Cameron. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Joel.